and welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast. My name is Mari Beveridge. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Robert Mogielnicki. Mr. Mogielnicki is a senior resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. He created and leads the Next Gen Gulf article series, examining technology trends in Arab Gulf states and looking east, the China Gulf Initiative. A specialist in the political economy of the Middle East and North Africa, he is a term member at the Council on Foreign Relations. He also teaches a graduate level seminar on China, Middle East and North Africa relations as an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service and the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. What a title. Robert Mogielnicki, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to start off with your role as resident scholar at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Can you just walk us through what it involves and what is the general nature of your area of study?
Oh, absolutely. Thanks again for inviting me to this podcast. So I manage the political economy research at the Arab Gulf States Institute. We focus primarily on GCC states, plus Iraq, Iran, and Yemen as a primary focus. And then we bring in the rest of the region and indeed other parts of the world as and when they relate to Gulf countries. My political economy portfolio is quite wide-ranging. So in any given week, I could be looking at energy dynamics, labor dynamics, regulations, trade, and investment across a number of different Gulf countries. But there are also some areas that I specialize in. Recently, I've been spending a lot of time looking at sovereign wealth funds. I also spend a great deal of time trying to unpack China's role in the region. And earlier in my kind of academic and research career, I spent a lot of time looking at special economic zones and free zones. So it's quite a broad portfolio, but one that is quite fulfilling and keeps me rather busy.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, it sounds like it. And you also created and lead the Next Gen Gulf series of publications, which examines technology trends in Arab Gulf states. And can you talk us through what the key trends in technology related to fossil fuels and also non-fossil fuels in the Gulf sort of involve?
Sure. Well, yeah, this research series really emerged early on after joining the Institute. I've been with the Institute for about 5 years. And when I joined, I realized that there was a gap in research on how technology trends were shaping both the governments and the economies in this really critical region of the world. And a few years ago, the technology space and the initiatives that we saw coming out of the region were quite different than what we see today. And I'd be willing to say somewhat less ambitious. I mean, a few years ago, what we heard a lot about was, we have to digitize government, government departments and government services, or we need to increase the level of non-cash transactions in our societies. And indeed, this happened throughout and leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic. But in the aftermath of the pandemic, and really in the last year or two, I think we've seen this focus on technology really be pushed into overdrive. And there's a much greater emphasis on emerging technologies and advanced technologies like artificial intelligence. And that's really that area of the technology domain and how that new investment focus and prioritization of technology trends is impacting governments and economies across the region is actually where I'm spending a lot of my time these days, trying to figure out exactly what's going on. And we see sovereign wealth funds committing billions and billions of dollars to these new initiatives. So it's a good research series. It's one that's very much a work in progress and a living research series, if we want to describe it as that.
And you mentioned China earlier as well, very briefly. I want to kind of get into that a little bit. You founded the Looking East, the China Gulf Initiative. Where does that relationship lie between Gulf countries and China? And is China more than an arm's length buyer of fossil fuels and a supplier of consumer goods?
It's a good question. Look, I think it's important to say from the outset that the foundation of the relationship between China and Gulf countries to my mind, is an economic one, and it's an economic foundation that rests on a very robust energy trade. I expect that dimension of ties to continue for the foreseeable future. That being said, in the past several years, we have those of us who've been looking at these multifaceted relationships have seen that China's role across the region has really gradually expanded into other economic domains beyond the energy sector and also to non-economic domains. We see Beijing playing a more important role as a diplomatic player across the region, helping to broker deals between major powers and rivals across the region, and also increasingly looking to increase its influence and global profile by widening its activities and influence in the region. So again, I think this is another important area to watch. It'll be even more important with the incoming Trump administration in Washington, which is likely to take, to have a different tenor of relations with China over the coming years.
Well, absolutely. I mean, let's talk about that. The US election, right? This is, if we can move into US politics, there have been a few developments in the last couple of weeks. What are your thoughts on the election result? Trump has been a strong advocate, obviously, for fossil fuels and energy independence. I wonder what your thoughts are on how it will affect this sort of US relationship with the Gulf.
Sure. Well, this is a big topic to unpack. So maybe we could focus on the energy side of relations first, and then move into and then after that think about some of the other foreign policy implications or the expected foreign policies that we're likely to see coming out of the incoming Trump administration and how that would impact the Gulf. On the energy side, I have a colleague, Ben Cahill, who wrote that the Trump administration is mostly good for oil and gas companies. I think it's largely assumed that the Trump administration will reduce a lot of the red tape, kind of cut regulations, lower taxes in a way that, generally speaking, is going to be positive news, at least for U.S. oil and gas companies. And the general expectation is that's going to, at some point in the future, boost the supply of energy commodities on the world market. Now, what that means for the Gulf. Well, at the moment, Gulf producers and members of OPEC Plus have been trying for some time to really get control of global energy prices and push those prices in a direction that are more suitable for producers. And we know that countries like Saudi Arabia want to see prices that are significantly higher than they currently are. So I think what may be good in terms of energy policy coming out of a Trump administration for oil and gas companies in the U.S. is not necessarily going to be a positive development for the Gulf region when we think about the impact on state finances. So, I mean, that's just one area that we're going to have to wait and see what happens in this new coming administration. There's also the potential for a return to maximum pressure on Iran. And with that will likely come a stricter enforcement of sanctions on Iran to choke some of Iran's oil exports. And that will kind of is the flip side of the energy coin. If we do see a very strict enforcement of sanctions on Iranian oil, that might give OPEC Plus producers a little bit more room and a little bit more leverage to move, and also to move prices up into a direction that they're a little bit happier with.
It's interesting. There's just so much there that I want to ask you about, but I'm so aware of time. And looking more internationally on this, how do you think large economies across the world will react to the new president with regards to their own energy policies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I was reminded the other day that the U.S. election is not something that Americans just watch. It's what the whole world watches, and we know we weren't necessarily surprised that Trump won the presidency. He's been president before, and now he'll come back. But I think just how handily he won the election was a big surprise to us here in Washington, and I suspect many audiences across the world. Look, I mean, one of the big policy reversals that is likely to happen on the energy front, and will have an impact for producers globally, producers and consumers, will be the likely reversal of the pause on the LNG export authorizations that we did see coming out of the Biden administration in conjunction with the Department of Energy. Trump, during his campaign, has vowed to reverse that pause. So, that's something that I suspect many international observers will be looking at and expecting to happen. And then it just depends to what degree his administration seeks to revise or potentially potentially reconsider in a more disruptive fashion in terms of other major policies like the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually has, despite its name, has significant implications for energy companies that are involved in cleaner and greener forms of energies, whether it's renewables or hydrogens, or the hydrogen sector. And I think by and large, many oil and gas companies, at least in the U.S., were very supportive of the IRA. So we'll have to watch very closely what Trump does to this policy and the impacts that it will have both in the U.S. and internationally.
Okay, interesting. Right, let's move on and discuss. I want to talk about the GCC a little bit and the Gulf Cooperation Council, and you've written about the role of free zones in the GCC. The region seems to have a lot of them. What are they supposed to achieve? And maybe a big question, do they really work?
Yeah, that's a big question. So what are free zones supposed to achieve? Well, free zones are primarily positioned as facilitators of trade and investment in the region. And when they were initially created, they initially started appearing in the region a few decades ago in the 80s. They really accomplished three things. First, they allowed foreign investors to maintain, in many cases, full control of their ventures, 100% ownership of their companies or their ventures in a region where in many cases there are caps on foreign ownership. Second, they enabled the importation of foreign labor. So again, in a region where in many cases there are requirements that force companies to employ a certain percentage of citizens, of local citizens and local workers, free zones enabled companies to sidestep many of these regulations and import workforces that are in many cases 100% composed of expatriates. And then finally, we saw kind of exemptions on taxes and other fees like customs duties too. So those traditionally have been the three main incentives that companies operating and registered in free zones across the region have sought, and those are the types of incentives that have been attractive to companies. Those have started to change a bit over the years, but by and large, they still remain really important parts of what a free zone has to offer. And this is really where we see the major, foreign multinationals being most comfortable setting up. And as I think you mentioned, the UAE is the primary hub of free zones. You have dozens of free zones in Dubai, many more in other emirates across the country. But we do see other GCC countries quite interested in setting up free zones, with Saudi Arabia being really at the forefront. The Saudi Minister of Investment has talked about creating dozens of free zones. Only a couple have emerged over the past couple of years, but I expect that many more are likely in the pipeline.
Okay, now I'm aware of time, so I'm going to ask these next couple of questions, and hopefully we can get through them, relatively quickly. I want to ask you about Gulf states transforming their economies away from a sort of dependency on fossil fuels. And are these efforts succeeding, do you think?
It depends on the country. I mean, we see some countries like the UAE that has federal entities like Dubai that have, very limited energy resources at the moment and been more or less forced to diversify. Other countries are face kind of less urgent situations like Qatar or Kuwait, for example. But I think perhaps the most important country to look at to answer this question over the coming years is Saudi Arabia. This is a country, substantial oil and gas resources, but also a very kind of an increasingly urgent need to diversify. Um, Look, I think the numbers in a country like Saudi Arabia, the numbers don't necessarily indicate massive progress on economic diversification just yet. But what we're seeing the government do on the ground in terms of creating new non-oil industries, massive giga projects, and other initiatives is definitely laying the groundwork for a broader transformation of the economy. But I think it's just too early to tell right for at the current moment.
Well, I mean, if we can then very quickly talk about COP29, which
Sure.
recently concluded in Baku in Azerbaijan. Obviously, there's always lots of criticism around it, whether or not it has enough teeth, these kinds of things, and the sort of COP process. Do you think that getting nearly 200 countries to agree on steps needed to tackle climate change is a feasible process? Just a few countries are significant CO2 emitters. Why don't they tackle the problem? Questions like this. What is your sort of view on whether or not COP is effective?
Well, there seemed to be more excitement with the COP28 in the UAE, and maybe I'm biased because I was following it more closely, given that it was happening in the UAE, and it's a country a little bit closer to my research and to home, so to speak. I sensed more frustration with the developments or the lack of commitments and momentum that we saw coming out of COP29. And I think whether people are happy with the outcome really depends on who you ask. You did have an agreement reached ultimately about kind of commitments from developing countries over the next, I think through 2035. That some said this is continued progress, and this is what is needed to help finance the global energy transition. But we do know that that many developing countries and their representatives were upset with the results, that they were pushing for much greater level of commitment from developed countries to help with this energy transition. So, I think that even though some commitments were reached, there was a lot of frustration, especially on the developing countries side of things.
My final question, I want to ask you about labour practices in the Middle East and in some Gulf states. It's something that you've written about and sort of spoken about before. Many resource-rich countries are taking steps to increase quantity and quality of jobs. And could you comment on some of the successes in this area and sort of what needs to be done?
Yeah, it's a really important area because while we like to talk a lot about economic diversification in the region, sometimes it's easy to get lost in the numbers around economic diversification. When it comes to labor, this really gets to the heart of people's economic welfare in the region. So, their jobs, their salaries, ability to take care of their families and have economic security and well-being. And this is a struggle for governments across the region, especially governments who oversee demographics where there is a large portion of expatriates in their countries, like in Qatar and Kuwait and the Emirates. They have to balance the needs of both their local citizens and their expatriates. And I think what we see in many countries is essentially governments offering sticks and carrots to firms, especially international firms, to make sure that they hire local citizens, that they provide them with high quality, and well-paying jobs when appropriate, and ensure that there is this skills transfer, especially when a big multinational is coming in and creating a AI hub, for example, in a country like Saudi Arabia. The Saudis really want training and skills transfer for Saudi citizens. But on the other hand, so those are kind of That's one side of the sticks and carrots equation. But in order to make that happen, governments find themselves in a position where they have to also give incentives to international firms. So we also see the flip side is usually, okay, hire our citizens, train them. We might even help you pay some of their salaries. We see that in some countries. But the flip side is, in addition to that, you may get a number of preferential, tax exemptions, for example. So the labor dynamics is not something that you can look at in isolation. It's really it's intertwined across a wide range of political economy issues, and it's something that these that Gulf governments are going to have to grapple with for the foreseeable future.
Thank you so much. I mean, so much to think about. We've crammed so much into such a short space of time. Robert Mogielnicki, that is our final question. Thank you so much. On behalf of the Al-Attiyah Foundation and myself, we'd like to thank you for joining us today and providing our listeners with your valuable insights on technology and political developments in the GCC. The Foundation very much looks forward to having you back on and continuing this conversation soon.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for listening. A new Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast will be released in the coming weeks, so be sure to check out our website and social media pages.